We're about to open. I guess I'm the clerk of the court or something like that. So both sides have 15 minutes to present their main arguments, and I will be keeping time. There will be a guillotine. Let me just remind you, this is a complaint under the optional protocol. There are no procedural issues. Actually, there are lots of procedural issues, but let's assume there are no procedural issues, so we just focus on the substance. So over to the complainant for 15 minutes. Perhaps you'd introduce yourself and who is the lead advocate. Your time starts now.
Okay, so we call on the first speaker from the complainant side. And if you could introduce yourself to him as well, please.
All right.
More comfortable sitting down, please remain seated.
Okay, thanks. Good afternoon, distinguished judges, upper house. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished audience, distinguished representatives of our state of Ruritania. My name is Farhad. I represent a disability NGO called Paradigm Shift. Well, and I would like to introduce the members of our team. Lola on my left, she has a psychosocial disability. Vanessa on my right, she has a physical disability, and Jason on my right too. And she has a visual disability, so we represent a cross-disability organization. We came here to participate, to put our case here in front of you because we believe that you are the last resort we can apply to. And now I'm going to discuss why. I'm going to explain you why. Our organization, as I said, is a grassroots cross-disability organization. Was established in 2014 in the state of Ruritania, but then after the government actually adopted 3 pieces of legislation, we have to be closed down, and we got a huge fine both on my organization and on the head of the organization. We are facing a lot of difficulties now. The 3 pieces of legislation I'm talking about is the Charity Act, the Democracy Act, and the Surveillance Act, Transparency and Surveillance Act. And our point is that these 3 pieces of legislation contradict the convention of the International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which our country ratified in the year 2007. And by ratifying the convention, it took the obligations to perform all the principles which are in this convention. So our argument is that the 3 acts I'm talking about contradict, first of all, the general principles of this convention described in Article 3, which is Article 3, point B, non-discrimination, point C, social inclusion, and point E, equality in opportunities. And actually, if we go to Article 4, which is general obligations, it's said there that states parties which ratified the convention should refrain from actually any practice or any activity which are inconsistent with the present convention. And these 3 pieces of legislation are absolutely inconsistent with this convention, because if we look at Article 29, which is equal participation in political and public life, it actually represents the International Covenant on Cultural and Civic and Political Rights here. And it says that states parties should create equal opportunities for persons with disabilities to participate in public affairs, and the equality should be kept regardless of the status of the organization, and etc. And also in B2, it says that joining and forming the organizations to represent persons with disabilities on local, international, and national level should also be the right of persons with disabilities. But we feel that these 3 pieces of legislation actually, especially the charity law, which refrains us from doing advocacy, because we have to, since we are paying taxes, we are not paying the taxes. We have tax exemptions. We can't participate in advocacy.
Councillor, may I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
You're referring to Article 29.
Yes.
And Article 29 says that the state party has to guarantee your equal opportunity on an equal basis with
Correct.
others. Now, these acts that you're complaining against certainly have an impact on your organization.
Right.
But doesn't it also impact all other organizations, whether they are organizations of people with disabilities? Aren't you being treated the same way as all other civic society?
Well, thanks for the question. Actually, as you're saying, the states should provide equal opportunities for participation, but the problem here is that since we are getting tax exemptions, we are deprived of these equal opportunities to do advocacy as other organizations do, which do not have any tax exemptions, and this is depriving us of this actually right to do so. And if we look at the second piece of legislation, which is the Democracy Act, we are also prevented of doing some activities with other organizations, let's say with international organizations, with international donors, and this also violates our right for international cooperation, which is described in Article 32 of this convention.
If I could just ask a supplementary question, does it impact on your group more than any other group, or in a different way than any other group in civic society?
Well, we are representing actually civil society, especially like persons with disabilities. We are a part of civil society, and we are bringing this case here because it is the first precedent in our country, this first case in our country, and we wanted to make it something like strategic so that it won't be happening in the future. That's why we're bringing it here. And I would like to give the floor to my colleague Jason, who is going to continue our arguments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Farhad. Now, I'd like to talk about our legal system, especially the new Charity Act, the Transparency Act, and the Surveillance Act has been violated to the Article 21 and Article 22 of the CRPD. You know that the freedom of expression and opinions are the common principle of each people and each nation of the whole human society. Yeah. It is not only stipulated in the CRPD, but also stipulated in our Constitution. But our new charity law says a charity group cannot do anything about the advocate. Otherwise, it will lose its charity status and lose its duty advention. So I think it's limited our freedom of expression and opinions because we charity group have the right to do just as our own ideas, such as to do service, to do support, and to do advocate. So, moreover, Article 22 means the respect of privacy, but our new law of the transparency law and the surveillance law require each member of a civil society group in our country must register our cell phone number, our email address, and our Facebook account, our every personal communication, our every social media account to the board, to the authority. So I think if we register each of our personal information to the authority, whatever we say and whatever we do will be surveilled by the government. You do everything. I are always looking at you, at your back. And what do you feel? Maybe you are afraid of to say anything against the government. You know that? So you must say you must to say the government is very good. Yeah, it's have what they do is always the advantage to the country, but no disadvantage to the country. But it's maybe it's not freedom of your own expression and of your own opinion. Yeah. But not. That's only a part of the story. So next, the phone will be given to my colleague, and she will tell you more disadvantages of our legal system.
You can just objection.
A respectful court.
We have an objection here. Yes.
The reference to the government being a authoritative state without any basis. We are a democratic nation. And we have the National Human Rights Commission that we are somehow behaving as a big brother entity to watch about, and is not substantiated per se. So this is our objection.
All right. Well, I'm sure that will be dealt with by the complainant in due time.
Thank you for your questions. Well, you know, our rule. I can answer this objection. I think Ruritania is a member of the United Nations, so and the United Nations law maybe is higher than our domestic laws. Yeah, so. Yeah, so our laws cannot violate the conventions of the UN. Yeah, that's my answer.
Very good. Well, you have your answer, member of the government. Next.
And I would like to give the floor to our colleague Lola, who is going to continue the argument.
Thank you very much. Respectful court, respectful representatives from the government. I would like to tell you that international obligation, according to the Article 32 of CRPD, it makes the state of Mauritania to oblige to ensure for the international cooperation to facilitate the capacity building of organization and cooperation, technical assistance, and develop and promote assistive devices. So I'm, as a responsible organization for the international cooperation, need to say that the new Protection of Democracy Act 2015 violates the Article 32, especially in the Section 10, which says prohibits all receipts of DPOs or civil society organizations of foreign or financial and other assistance, including indirect assistance. This provision of Democracy Act is broad, so it's not makes us possible to use or to develop any international cooperation. So, for example, international exchange, or even to use the website of other organizations. But the international cooperation is crucial for the DPOs because it's important to use the international approaches to learn how to make the better accessibility based on the evidence-based and approaches and on the new technological devices.
Okay, so, may I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Does Article 29 impose positive duties, or is it purely prohibitory in nature? Does it actually impose positive duties on governments?
So can you answer? Excuse me, respectful judge, I have a disability with my psychosocial thing, so please can you repeat your question, please, in the most simple way?
And I love the way you hold the microphone to your colleague.
So maybe I can answer. Maybe you will find the answer later in my speech.
My question is whether your case is that the Article 29 makes it a duty of government to positively act to avoid discrimination, rather than to avoid things that maybe discriminate.
Excuse me, I'm going to answer because I was working on Article 29. The thing is that, yeah, government should have to do positive things to avoid discrimination, like to create equal opportunities for different organizations so that they could equally participate in the society, so that persons could form their own organizations and advocate for their rights, and other people, just persons with disabilities, could just join organizations without being threatened by surveillance or by other things like that.
Does that mean that the legislation impacts on your group more than anyone else, giving you a right to complain to the committee?
Yes, sure, because we felt we felt that we are under discrimination because of these 3 pieces of legislation which were adopted. That's why we actually came here as to the last resort to bring our case.
It's important to remember that we are not saying that we should not protect the integrity of our democracy system. But we are trying to remember that restrictive laws, that it's not allowing the transference of technology from developed countries to developing countries, will deny the right of people with disability for this access for technology that could remove barriers for mobility, communication, and access to information. For example, I myself, I cannot walk. I cannot go to a bus.
Time's up.
Thank you.
Change is coming.
If there are any more outbreaks of this kind of behavior, we'll have to clear the committee room. Okay, I now call on the first speaker for the villainous government of Ruritania.
Honorable committee members, thank you for this opportunity. We will try to respond to some of the claims by the NGO, Paradigm Shift Now, and its former CEO. I'm here representing the government of Ruritania, and here are my colleagues, Boglarka, Claudio, and Sagata. I want to mention to the honorable committee members that Ruritania is a democratic state which believes in respecting and promoting rights, including rights of persons with disability. And we cite the CRDP Convention and its optional protocol. We have signed all these international instruments, and this assures to the committee members that the country is committed really to promote the rights of individuals, including rights of persons with disability. But we believe that such rights, including all the rights in all other international humanitarian instruments, are sustained by or are enhanced if a democratic state is sustained. And of course, as you can understand from different international human rights instruments, then the balance must be made, because to get the rights sustainable, then we have to work on some other issues too. So it's not only about specific individual rights that we talk about, but to make that right sustainable, we have to create this democratic, we have to enhance and promote these democratic institutions and democratic society. So these 3 laws in contention, the Charities Act, Protection of Democracy Act, and Transparency in Democracy, of course supplemented by the Surveillance Act 2012, we believe that this will enhance the democratic society in our country by creating the balance between public interest, what we call the public good, and then individual rights interests. Because if we promote the public good, then finally we are trying to respect the rights of every individual, including individuals with disabilities. So
ask you a question here?
Please.
You're saying that you are bringing in, you are a democracy, and these particular legislations have been brought in order to sort of protect democracy. But are you not, in trying to protect democracy, every one of these legislations, are they not killing democracy? All the basic rights have been taken away. So what is left?
Yeah. So by the arguments which will be made by my co-counsels, then we will try to show that the enactment of these legislations will, in the long term, help us in promoting these rights better.
But there would be nothing left for the long term if you're going to kill everything in the short term.
That will show in our arguments, of course. And I just want to mention that we're not killing them in the short term too, because we will be talking about what legitimate aim we had and what safeguards we have put to protect this kind of rights, even at the short term. So we believe that the enactment of these three documents are within the mandates of the international human rights instruments, with the exceptions that are stated in international human rights instrument, including the ICCPR, of course. So my co-counsels will discuss about how these laws can be justified in a democratic society by showing that these laws were enacted with a legitimate aim, and then of course they respect the proportionality element, and finally we will also explain how the safeguards are put in the short term to respect that these rights are not abused. Thank you very much.
Councillor, you talked about this law coming with a legitimate aim, but if you look at the definition of discrimination in Article 2, it says that you can have discrimination even if the aim is legitimate, but if the effect denies rights and opportunities for people with disabilities. Would you address that, please?
So one of the arguments we'll be making will be demonstrating the fact that these laws are not discriminatory. So if the council members can wait a little bit for our arguments. Thank you.
Objection? Objection? Okay. We were discussing here.
Lucky you, you get the objection.
And we realize that you are talking about human rights. We are talking about human rights. Looking to your table, we can see that there is no gender equality. Just one woman at the table.
We are here to discuss.
We are saying human rights.
I'm going to rule out that objection because one of the rules of the competition is that arguments in the Latin word is ad hominem, which means directed towards a particular man, should not be permitted. And making gender-specific attacks on the other side is therefore precluded. So I'm ruling out that disgraceful objection.
So may I continue? Yes. Thank you. As my colleague mentioned, my aim is to demonstrate to you that the measures we have implemented and how the legislation as it was applied in the case of the NGO present here were serving a legitimate aim. And as my colleague also mentioned, our state believes and recognizes that freedom of association, the freedom to participate in public and political life, the right to privacy are the foundations of a democratic society. But they are not rights that are unrestricted. And nobody, in our understanding and in compliance with international human rights bodies, nobody is allowed to rely on these rights in order to weaken or destroy the ideas and values of a democratic society.
Objection.
Are you prepared to take an objection? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
You're saying that you are respecting the right for privacy, but since you adopted this Surveillance Act, it's clearly stating that you can have, you can do you can tap our phones, you can check our emails,
yeah,
you can just listen to whatever. So it's absolutely
as I mentioned
inconsistent
before,
with
the
this
recognition of right to privacy is not an absolute right. We recognize that there is an interference with these rights. What we demonstrate here is that the interference served the legitimate aim, and that it was absolutely necessary in a democratic society.
So what exactly is proportionate about the interference with rights here?
The proportionality will be discussed by my colleague. As I mentioned, I'm talking about the...
What is the legitimate aim?
Yes, the legitimate aim is, as I mentioned already, we believe that nobody can rely on these rights to destroy the values of a democratic society. As you are aware, we have evidence from our country and from the surrounding countries in our region of certain breakaway regions. We have evidence of instability. We have evidence of foreign powers infiltrating these countries to destabilize the state.
I have an objection here.
Yes.
Excuse me, you're talking about other countries. The human rights are universal, and any public interest should not be put higher than human rights. And in our country, we don't have any breakaway regions. We don't have any instability. We have a peaceful state which should be developing under the democratic principles of human rights.
As I mentioned to you, we didn't talk about only foreign countries. We mentioned that we have evidence in our country of pushy and well-organized civil society groups that we are not sure about what their actual objectives are. We also have evidence of national and religious minorities. And the breakaway, we have the fear that if there is dissolution of neighboring states, in our neighborhood could very well lead to the dissolution of our country. But
Councillor,
if I may...
Councillor, if I may, do you have evidence that Paradigm Now is engaged in those activities? It appears to me that the evidence that we have before us is that they were using money from foreign countries to help people with disabilities with self-help and involvement with government activities. Do you have evidence outside of that?
The measures that we have adopted and us are serving a general purpose. And we try to demonstrate that they are tailor-made enough to be able to respond to all circumstances.
Objection.
Are you prepared to take yet another objection? By the way, so everyone knows, the clock stops during this. So, yep.
You said that government to interfere the communication of freedom has a reasonable purpose, but in our new transparency law, every member and every staff of a civil rights group should be informed of our personal information. How do you explain this previous? Why do you interfere every member and every workers in NGOs?
Well, as I mentioned, proportionality of these measures is going to be covered by my colleague. But if you would like to have an answer now, I can give an answer. But let me then continue with what are the aims of these measures, because the reason why we oblige all members of non-governmental organizations to register is basically related to the legitimate aims or values and principles that we would like to protect with these measures. Yes.
Could I ask you, is your team under surveillance in the same way?
Is my team?
Yeah, your legal team.
We are not members of a civil society.
Oh, no?
No.
Pretty good answer.
We don't want to destroy our state. And we don't want to destroy our state either.
But if the Surveillance Act has a very well-defined target group, which every individual is aware of once you read the legislation. So it's not randomly selected. Once you are falling under the criteria established by the law, you might be subjected to surveillance. But I think we built in safeguards in the system to ensure that people know whether they fall under the scope of this legislation or not. What I wanted to mention, or would like to mention, if there are no further objections, is that as you have understood, we have evidence about certain foreign forces targeting the democracies in the region, including our state. Now, we understand that, and there is also historical evidence that sometimes civil society organizations disguise their real aim before.
Objection.
Yeah.
CIA.
Excuse me.
Okay, I'm going to allow a very short objection, in the form of a question, I think, this time.
Do you have any evidence of us doing like that?
As I meant, this already has been raised. I already answered to this question.
Okay, excuse me. Can you at least distinguish between some opposition NGOs and NGOs of persons with disabilities?
No.
Okay, thank you.
So what we would try to avoid is that certain civil society and NGOs disguising in the principles of democracy actually infringe or weaken our state security. As a state, we understand that we have the obligation to secure the rights and freedoms of everybody within our jurisdiction. And it also means to secure national security, the pluralism of the state, including the protection of minority groups, and not favor certain majority groups who might have additional financial resources. And we have the obligation to secure the functioning of smaller NGOs. Now, if so all these measures that were put in place were with the perspective to protect these values, and we have the understanding that...
1 more minute.
Yeah. Okay, then I'd just rather pass it on my colleague.
All right, we would like to state, as the state of Mauritania, that our legislation is rather not discriminatory, because it applies to all the NGOs. So as the distinguished judges pointed out, and the opponents could not elaborate on, these legislation are not discriminatory, but they're aimed to save the democracy. The Charitable Act and the tax deductions, that's public money that need to be subjected to certain criteria. The Protection of Democracy Act is important because it only limits the foreign sources, but there is also the possibility of internal financing and the member financing through members. So those and also the cooperation is still possible. Contrary to the argument of the opponent, the cooperation is possible, so our measures are proportionate, and that's not an absolute right that will ban NGOs at all in our state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now
Honorable committee members, can I have a request for explanation?
I think the ball goes back to the complainant side now.
Yeah, but it's just a question for explanation, because in the oral hearing rules it says that time spent on explaining for the objections or in responding to objections will not be counted. I just want to make sure it's the case in this. They're not.
As I already explained, the clock stops when those.
There was an extra minute and 15 seconds added on for you.
Is the government of Mauritania happy now?
No.
Okay, well, the ball goes back now to the complainant side, and you have a short period of responding.
Thank you. Actually, Mauritania is a democratic country, but democracy doesn't mean the government can have the power to tell the lies. The government said our laws obey the international law, and the government said protect our human rights, but you know that our DPO Paradise Shift now has been closed, just because our recept the foreign monies. How do you explain that? Recept foreign monies means damage our democracy, and our CEO has been get a huge fine of 0.5 million euros, which is as large as the whole salary of a year. And how do you explain that he damaged the democracy of our country?
Thank you. And now I call on the government to respond, and we give you a flexible 1 minute to respond to address any concerns you might have.
We actually have 5 minutes.
Sorry, flexible 5 minutes.
Well, thank you for the flexible minute or the 5 minutes. All right. Thank you for the flexible minute or the flexible 5 minutes. What we want to stress is that all the laws together, they are not imposing a ban either on either on NGOs nor on civil society organizations, because they can function still. There are possibilities to raise money internally, and also the cooperation is not banned between the different organizations. Article 32 raised on the states, and we would like now to go on to the safeguards put in place by our states to make sure that the rights of civil society are still ensured by protecting democracy.
Could you please explain the proportionality, because that hasn't come through. I mean, we were assured that both in the long term and in the short term. So could you please explain that?
Well, the proportionality, let's say the tax from the Charitable Act, the tax deduction, they have certain criteria, but this is public money, so it is legitimate for the state to decide who will get money from it. And on the Protection of the Democracy Act,
if it is a democracy, then why is it that the government is to be having all the say in the matter of where the money would be used? Shouldn't citizenry have as much of a role to play? So how is it proportionate? That's the point I'm asking.
We are only deciding on public money, so basically the sources of private money are still available to the NGO and the human rights organizations, but our public money is coming from taxpayers, and we have to use it wisely, and our resources are not limitless, so that's why we have to put some safeguards on it, how we use them.
Do you say anything about the circumstances of your state which particularly would explain the measures which you have taken?
Well, the regional, all those measures are based on the evidence that that we have a huge regional instability, and we want to also with the religious groups that are infiltrated with and the evidence of history of NGOs being used as a means to overthrow governments. So our specific democracy and peaceful country have to be, we want to ensure that it keeps going up like that, and we still are top on the happiness UN happiness index, so that we can, but that cannot be done without any measures. And we are now passing on to the safeguards.
Now, it is understood that no law put in place comes without its safeguards. One of the basis of which these laws came into force was a demand by the opposition party that these laws need to be reviewed by the Ruritanian Human Rights Agency, the National Human Rights Commission of Ruritania, and all these violations of laws are subject to judicial review of that country. So we are also open to further scrutiny of the committee if so is required, and we are a transparent democracy where people's rights are protected as a whole. Therefore, when there are violations of human rights, we should be given the opportunity to correct them ourselves within the judicial framework of national judicial framework, and we are open to the idea of change as and when required. And as is just mentioned by my colleague, that these measures are put in place looking into the instability in the region. And therefore, within the review of 5 years, perhaps situations can change, and we will enact laws as is required then.
Objection.
Very good. If there is a given that we gave you a little bit of extra time, you can take an objection now, I think. Yeah.
Can I give an objection?
In a form of a question, though.
All right. You're saying that Ruritania is a transparent country. So can you please give us any evidence of foreign agents or foreign organizations trying to destabilize the country and to break the democracy in the country?
Regional instability is generally understood to regional instability is generally understood to have a possibility of insurgency being sprung up and terrorism perhaps. So as a protective measure, it is not illegitimate for us to put in place protective measures.
Okay. Thank you, honorable committee members. And I'm citing from the facts, actually. And this new phenomena is indicated in the fact that it says it sees the hand of foreign governments in fomenting discontent among religious minorities, and we can never be sure that this will not be done again and again, because we're seeing this kind of things, interferences, pressures now, and we have to do something about this. That's what we're talking about. Who does these things? Then the government does these things. When say the government as a democratic society, we are talking about the legislature, which is elected by the citizens. Every citizen has the right to vote. And then, as you can see from the facts too, there are two opposition parties, major opposition parties, which mainly control the government, and a small opposition, which also has 5% seats in the government.
I think you're aware that the convention that you've ratified requires that when you are considering and implementing legislation, you involve organizations of people with disabilities and people with disabilities themselves as you consider the legislation. Can you tell us how people with disabilities were voice was heard through the passage, the discussion and passage of these laws?
The minutes of the parliament, the legislature, it's clearly indicated that there has been civil societies represented in there, making objections.
I assume you're not referring to the calls from the gallery that were were not listened to by the legislators.
No. So in the deliberations of the legislature, civil activists have been there, and it's clearly indicated in the transcripts, actually, making objections and others.
Thank you very much. I think we'd better call the submissions to a close before the judges are asked to recuse themselves because of bias. The court...
They have 1 minute.
1 minute each, yeah. Sum up. So, complainant side, 1 minute.
Maybe now we have a lot of words wanted to say, but the time is limited. Today we stand here not only behalf of us, and not only behalf of the paradigm shift down, and not only on behalf of Ruritania, but also on behalf of the whole justice world. If this disadvantageous acts should not be null and void, if the opinion should be supported by the United Nations, we think a real democratic world, a real freedom country, and the justice society will be killed. So I think my colleague has more words to say to us.
Respectful judge, we know that you have a child with disability, and you know it's being the parent of a child with disability doesn't mean to have a control of her life, and just preventing and closing the DPO, you're preventing the future for your daughter, for her independent living. And I don't know which kind of disability she has, but it doesn't matter, because just imagine that in future she will be one of the person who would like to protect her rights and defend her independence.
Your time is up, I'm afraid. Thank you very much. Now the government of Transylvania, sorry, Ruritania.
Thank you very much. Would of course would like to hear more legal arguments from the NGO, and I'm sorry we didn't hear much. We're speaking about a country with multi-party democracy, with full respect for human rights. So the implementation we can discuss, but at least in paper we're talking about a country that respects human rights, that signs the optional protocol. And you can see how the commitment of that country is in terms of persons with disability and respecting their rights. So we're not talking about a certain legislation that affects only the disability organizations. We're talking about a document that affects every civil society. And this can never be discriminatory, as we say, for persons with disabilities. And with all the safeguards that we have discussed, that there is a government, there is national human rights institutions, and there is this honorable committee to always inspect us and to hear cases that come against this government. I think we have every safeguard to protect in the short term the abuse that may come because of these legislations, and in the long term we are trying to sustain the democracy that we have, which is exceptional in that particular region, of course, to make the rights very sustainable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The committee will now retire to consider its decision. We won't be too long.
We're back in session. We're going to talk a little bit about the argument before we render our decision. I'd like to compliment all of you on your preparation and your ability to put forward your arguments and to gain some confidence as the debate went on and deal with objections. That was all very well done. Let me also compliment the government team and the NGO team for their involvement in looking at, for me, I'm looking at this as I think, I've never been a judge, so as I think a judge would, which would be trying to have the argument that you're trying to put forward meet the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And for me, the discussion of Article 29, the problem that the complainants have in this case and that the government pointed out is that Article 29 talks about equal participation on an equal basis with others. So it's a very difficult argument to make that disability rights organizations are disadvantaged compared to other organizations, and that so that leads to the government's position on the Article 29 approach from my perspective. I also think, however, you were very skillful at finding other parts of the treaty so that you were just not relying on one type of an argument. And I think that the international cooperation argument is a very important one, because the idea behind that in the treaty is that we have around the world countries with some expertise, countries with money, other countries that need to rely on that expertise and money. And what you were pointing out is the government's actions here were stopping that process, and we're disadvantaging the disability community because of that. And I think that's a very strong argument that that provision of the treaty is being violated. And in all honesty, when I was thinking about this last night, I thought about that a little bit, but not quite as well as you put that forward, and I think that was quite useful. I also think that your discussion of Article 22 and the right to privacy was a very important article, and the discussion, that part of the treaty talks about arbitrary and unlawful interference. And I think that you did a very good job of discussing that, and I don't think the government's response was very strong on that. Basically, the government's response was, we're a good government, we're a democracy, we're going to do the right kind of thing. And I have to, people respond, and I've heard my own, I'm from the United States, I've heard my own government say that when they were violating privacy laws of its citizens. And so perhaps those were my takes on this, and I'll.
Okay. I would sort of take a little bit from what my colleague has just spoken on, start with Article 29. And I think that the question which came from us was, to that extent, the whole question of equal basis with others needed to be understood also from that, is this law going to impact on this in the same way on disability organizations which are just getting into advocacy and are trying to get their rights being heard, as it is going to impact upon other members of civil society? And that was a point which I think should have been frontally made. You should have said that, yes, it is going to impact us differently because we are not on an equal basis with others. And we need these kinds of resources much more than the others. And I think that point kind of got lost somewhere. I mean, I agree. You take a formal notion of equality, then the point which came in from both my other colleagues, you didn't have an answer for. But if you take a substantive notion of equality, then you definitely could be questioning the government on the particular revision that came there. The other thing was that I continually asked the government on proportionality and to say that, okay, tell me how it is proportionate. And the only kind of answer that one kept getting was that yes, there is judicial review. We will look at it in 5 years' time. In 5 years' time, we may be all dead. It's that kind of, and proportionality is about the here and now. And therein, the sort of answer which needed to come, one did not find happening. And evidently, more challenge should have also come from the NGO complainant on the factor of proportionality. To saying that, yes, we accept, because they kept protesting about the fact that they are a law-abiding democratic country. If they're a law-abiding, rights-endorsing democratic country, it was important to say that, all right, as you are securing law and order, are you totally obliterating rights? Or are you somewhere in some way saving rights? Where are you saving rights? How are you saving rights? That's the critical part of the whole proportionality argument. The other thing on which you should have objected was the government saying that we as the government are the best people to decide where public money is going to be spent. In a democracy, why should it only be the government? It necessarily needs to be a joint kind of a venture that both sides should be worrying on, okay, where will the money be spent? And if people are having a say in, to ask the government, you tell us exactly, are we spending the money that we are getting on the activities that you want to prevent? If we are spending the money on the activities that you're trying to prevent, then it would be a proportionate response. If it is not, then you are in effect saying anybody spending any foreign money is suspect and hence can be closed down. So that kind, I mean, I'm just trying to put forth that you all came, these were greater possibilities in terms of the arguments which you could have fleshed out a little further, got them on the fact of, they also conflated, like what is it called, survival of the government with survival of the state. And I do think they're two different things. The survival of the government is not what is protected in terms of, but the survival of the state, if that is under challenge, that's a different kind. And there were a couple of places where the government did conflate it, so it might have been worthwhile for you to have got them on that particular objection. In terms of the government, of course, like all governments, made very, very forthright claims about showing us that both in the short term and the long term, everybody is going to be safe. But in the main, the claims were made, they were not substantiated. Thank you so much.
And it now falls to me to make one or two observations. I would like to preface what I have to say by making a serious observation in the light of events in Europe in the last 24 hours, because I think if illustration were needed about paradigm shifts, one can get an example both from what has happened in Britain and also what has happened in Ireland last year in the marriage equality referendum, where unexpectedly, in the eyes of many people in the rest of the world, we passed a referendum giving marriage equality to people of all gender orientation. That happened because the narrative was illustrated by individual people. It happened because it no longer became an abstraction, but it became a question of whether person A and person B could live together and whether that was a legitimate thing. Equally, I think there are lessons to be learned from what happened in Britain, because issues can be, during referendums, can be crystallized, sometimes very undesirably, into one or two issues, into the narrative. But the point I was going to make to those of you who are involved in rights action is paradigm shifts seem to me not only to come from the top, but from the bottom. And I think it's very important that we do not lose sight of that. And there are risks in seeking to bring about change only from top down, and that it is always important to ensure that change comes from the bottom up as well as from the top down, and that public opinion supports the changes which you're seeking to bring about. I merely make that point because it just seems to me to have been illustrated in the last, not only the last year or two, but it's a truth which is a broader one, I think. The second point is more focused on the issue here. Proportionality always seems to me a rather ambiguous legal concept. As a barrister, I argued a case here about the right to silence of suspects, which was rejected in the particular circumstances of the case by our courts on the basis of proportionality. And it went to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, where the judgment was reversed precisely on the same basis of proportionality. So proportionality can mean different things to different people. I merely mentioned that point also. I'd like to compliment both teams, who are absolutely super, because it was every year I've been lucky enough to be invited here. I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed the exchange of ideas. And this has been no exception, and I'm delighted to have met my colleague judges and delighted to have met all of you. By the way, I have to say one thing as a matter of regret. Your conduct as an audience was disgraceful. There were numerous demonstrations which were entirely unworthy of the United Nations Committee. And this kind of thing will no longer be tolerated. I want that made perfectly clear.
But it was very much in accord with the spirit of the
convention. It was, however, very much in accord with the spirit of the convention. To the winners and the losers. We have two individual winners, slightly unprecedentedly, because we thought that the contributions from both of these participants was particularly outstanding, and they're Jason King from the complainant side and Bart Laga from the government side. And as for the overall winners, it'll come as a huge surprise to you to know that, and I have to say here, it's always difficult coming from the government side, because of course it's a harder thing to argue, it's a harder uphill task to do. But we thought that on balance, the complainant side won. Thank you.
So I think we need a round of applause for Innocentia and Agassi for coaching the teams. So before we issue the certificates, our Senator John Dolan, he's here, will do that for us. Let's just throw it open momentarily to see what people in the groups in the audience think of the arguments, of the decision, or whatever. So we have a few minutes to do that. Yes.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, all those who favour the complainants, all those who think that the complainant's argument won, hands up.
All on that side.
Yeah. All right. All of those on this side who thought who think that the government side won. Okay, now the hard question. Is there anyone here whose mind was changed by the debate? Not one. No one, okay. And how many people consider that the complaint to the United Nations Committee was justified? Okay, all right. Okay.
That's it?
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Enjoy lunch.
Just a moment. So I'm just going to call on Senator John Dolan, who's here somewhere, to issue the certificates. Is he in the room?